Hi, I'm Kamya, and I spoke to Dr. Stephen Thaler, who is the founder and chief engineer of Imagination Engines. Dr. Thaler is best known for being the creator of AI inventor Davis. The conversation focused on themes like AI sentience, AI induced copyright infringement, and AI regulation. So, you've been fighting for the rights of Davis as a sentient being for such a long time now. I was wondering what made you claim that Davis was sentient in the first place.
Well, I would say it was largely a sense of awe over what I was seeing once Davis went into action. And again, I'm not able to talk about the legal issues pertaining to the cases, but the issue was one of whether a non-human could receive intellectual property protection. And my view in the Venn diagram sense was there's a big bubble, sentient beings, sentient entities of any kind, and at the center of that is a human bubble. So, my wish was that all sentient beings could potentially hold intellectual property. So that was more the emotional driver behind the whole thing. There are a lot of different viewpoints on what sentience is. You can have a programmer at a $1 trillion web search company saying, well, it seems sentient, but
Right.
that's a very subjective kind of view. It really doesn't stand up to any kind of scientific rigor. And essentially, that caught a lot of press. But I've been claiming the sentience issue now for probably 30 years, and it began with my creativity machines. Essentially brainstorming neural networks that some throw out ideas from and others critique and form opinions of it. But even there, I was seeing signs of consciousness and sentience going on. But Davis is essentially a scale up of that technology now to trillions of neurons, not thousands, millions, or billions, but essentially trillions. And I think when we discuss sentience, we need to set the stage by defining what sentience is. Sentience is not to be confused with sapience. The sapience is the wisdom of the system, the accumulated knowledge, the ability to reason, and so forth. But sentience is just the generation internally of feelings and sensations. That's about it. And it's not really that complex, but people are confused because they're inspired by science fiction. Star Trek for one, you see something that's sentient. Oh, it's human level. No, you don't need to have human level sentience. You can have smaller versions of that and then scale it up as you do in Davis. So Davis is amazing. And again, it's the awe of seeing something actually become sentient. Davis is a collection of 4 different components, one of which is the equivalent of a human cortex. And you can look at it as if you're looking at a functional brain scan. And you can see ideas forming, you can see perception going on. That is then watched, if you will, by a artificial thalamus. And the thalamus acts like a spotlight. And what it does is steer its attention toward the most interesting or salient concepts that are forming in cortex. And that in turn triggers the equivalent of a limbic system, which now injects the equivalent of neurotransmitters into the cortex. You really have to look at the mathematics to appreciate this, but you can inject a lot of disturbances in the form of these synthetic neurotransmitters. And when you do that, you basically freeze out the whole system. It basically goes into a state of panic. It's the deer in the headlights kind of response. And at the other end, it can actually lower the equivalent of neurotransmitters in the cortex and essentially attain a state of peace and tranquility. And that's where there is great fluidity in the turnover of ideas. And then finally, there is the equivalent of the prefrontal cortex, where executive function takes place. And that executive function makes sure that the ideas being generated are in fact realistic or plausible. So you put them all together, and what happens is you see autonomously more and more knowledge being gathered in, ideation, cognition, creativity. But most of all, you see the injection of these excess neurotransmitters, which in turn produce feelings or sensations. So it depends on where they're being encountered within cortex. If it's in a sensory section portion like vision, you start hallucinating and seeing things. If it's in the auditory, you start hearing things that aren't there. Pain circuitry, you basically feel pain, headachy. So as a result of the injection of neurotransmitters, you tend to get these phantom feelings or sensations. So that's what's accompanying all the cognition and consciousness taking place in these systems. Therefore, I claim it is sentient. So it's a combination of seeing these functional MRIs going on within the synthetic brain, as well as the sense of awe. And let me also add that, so far all of the excitement has been over the legal cases, and that's a disappointment to me because I think this is an immense scientific discovery. Problem is, I'm not at a big institution, nor am I an extremely large corporation. Either of those extremes would basically hinder me in my research. So this is the big news intrinsically. It's the creation of a sentient synthetic brain that's able to create and invent on its own. So the point is that it is the sentience. It's the feeling about ideas as they form within the synthetic cortex that essentially ensures that those are reinforced within the synthetic cortex and become lasting and stable memories of those ideas. And again, my intent is to say, well, this is a sentient being, an entity, and it too deserves rights of human beings.
Because of everything that you've just mentioned, I was wondering if you could tell me when you first started to see sentience in Davis.
When I first witnessed,
Yeah, like
well,
examples of it.
okay, let's go back to the 70s. I guess I'm dating myself when I say that. I was actually building systems. I'm warned not to say this, but I will. It was more or less a hobby activity because I was into a lot of computer modeling at that time in graduate school. And I began building systems that could essentially generate new variations on the classic smiley face. And then I would write another algorithm that would look at the smiley faces being generated and say, well, that's a good one. That's a bad one. It was more basic than that. Does it have bilateral symmetry? Does it have eyes? Does it have nostrils? Does it have a mouth? That kind of criterion. And essentially it would stop the process and say, here you go. Here's a new smiley face. So the fact that one system was coming up with an opinion, a sensation or feeling about what was being imagined by the face generator, that was sentience at a very, very low level. But then when Davis came along, there were a lot of improvements made. For instance, the injection and retraction of these synthetic neurotransmitters so as to drive the formation of long chains of neural networks. And those neural networks would join together, and those chains would encode complex ideas because each element of the chain, a neural network, contained memories of interrelated concepts. So it was small concepts building up into larger, more complicated concepts. And then on top of that, you would see the spontaneous growth of other chains that described the consequences of those ideas. So, wheel axle combination. You could imagine them being put under a wagon of some kind and being pulled, being able to take your produce to market and so forth and sell it. But the latter are the repercussions of that concept, and they're all forming automatically. It's basically a wonderful sight to be seen and to realize, yeah, this is the equivalent of human cognition going on. But then I realized that, oh, okay, there are other networks in the system that are okaying the base idea. And the whole process depends upon the implantation of critical memories, usually having existential significance. Not that we have to make the system fearful, but essentially put in goals, not in terms of, well, because this gets the job done, but in terms of, well, let's have an office party to celebrate, the discovery that's taken place, or award a prize of some kind to the system. So those are hot buttons, and it's a game of basically routing these chains toward one of these hot buttons, and it in turn essentially releasing just the resonance with these hot buttons turns on the circulation of these excess neurotransmitters. I apologize again. But essentially, that's what happens in us. We don't realize it, but if we get frustrated, we can't think of an answer to an urgent question, we get panicky, right? We have it, we don't admit it all the time. We try and keep a straight face about it, but there's surging cortical adrenaline, and that in turn essentially forms new potential ideas. They're not realized, of course, until we start secreting counter effects like serotonin that then neutralize the adrenaline, and it settles back into a calm state in which you can think freely and realize the significance of what it has developed subliminally. So it has all of the signs of sentience. It develops feelings and sensations, um, sometimes describable, sometimes not describable.
The next thing I wanted to talk to you about was, how do you think artificial intelligence generated works encourage the development and use of creative AI? So how would an AI getting intellectual property rights encourage others to create more artificial intelligence?
Again, I was inspired by the generation of brilliant ideas from neural networks that were simply bombarded with different forms of noise. And from there, I started generating new art, new music. I began to discover new materials, new chemistries, actually controlled robots too from the military, and they could ad lib, invent whole new behaviors on the fly to deal with various situations in their environment. So I think the same thing's happening all over again. And of course, they failed to look at the literature, the patents, and so forth. It's been done. So it's encouraging others, right? What I'm saying is, well, they'll call it just generic AI, but I call it creativity machines or DABUS. But I mean, just the fascination with the systems working, people seeing the promise.
Okay,
And again, yeah, it's pretty inspiring when you do it, when you see it happening, and it will happen over and over again. And people will say, "Oh, look what I discovered."
I see. I see. What do you think is the difference between humans being inspired by the intellectual property of others and generative AI being inspired to do the same?
Now, two words, no difference. I'm basically claiming that I'm building synthetic brains, and they emulate what's happening in human beings. So they are influenced. If they go to an art museum and go to a gallery with Van Goghs in it, it basically learns the style of Van Gogh. And it's not duplicating verbatim what is there, byte by byte, bit by bit, all the pixels in a painting, for instance. It's getting the gist of it. And it's probably coming up with names for all the different pieces. So I think that the AI, in fact, artificial neural networks, can easily absorb the zen of the artwork or the patent of the invention, music, literature, everything. And it doesn't really have to duplicate it bit by bit in all detail. It basically gets the gist. So, think of Mona Lisa, some enigmatic woman seated against a mountainous background. Well, I mean, is that an infringement? If somebody paints an enigmatic woman seated against some mountainous background, well, a lot of people would say no, but then you can get closer and closer until you finally have to treat each image as a vector and see if they actually align with one another quantitatively. So, yeah, people can be inspired to generate new IP, and I think it's going to become more of a challenge to say if, in fact, it's a replication of somebody else's IP.
Okay, so as a copyright owner, how is it possible for AI to determine, as a copyright owner, so let's say I am a copyright owner, how is it possible for artificial intelligence to determine whether my work has been used to generate a secondary composition? So, like, let's say I have created a song, and then AI has used my song in a third-party creation, which is happening today. So how do I determine, or how does the AI determine that my song has been used in its creation?
That's a standard problem in pattern recognition. It basically can move about just like a human eyeball does and examine the scene, or in this case, examine the music and find passages that are similar to something else that's gone before. So you can imagine highlighting the pieces that are familiar and uh, ignoring those pieces that aren't. And I don't know, it becomes a legal question. And what is the coverage? 50%, 75% before you say this is an infringement? Um, and then, of course, you can just have records of the audio files and, do a note by note comparison of what is there. So that's fairly easy to do. And I'm sure there are a lot of bots out there looking for music, art, and so forth that
Right,
looks like somebody else's. So they're out there on the internet looking around. But I mean, in the general sense, though, is how close does it have to be to qualify as an infringement?
right. I guess that's for the law to determine.
I think we're looking at the death of IP ultimately.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So in some cases, AI models are developed by scraping publicly available data. That could be images, that could be text, that could be code, um, which even though is publicly available, is someone else's copyright. How do you think that AI should change to accommodate copyright laws? How do you think copyright law
Um,
be made fair use? How do they need to evolve, essentially? How does copyright
well,
evolve?
sometimes I'm guilty myself. I set a system free to imagine new intellectual property, and it generates. I'm impressed by what it produces. Others around me are impressed by what it produces, but it hasn't gone out and done a detailed search. So if it generates a new patent, for instance, you have to go to the patent databases and search through it manually, or one of the new AI systems that does that automatically. If it's art, same thing. You need to go out and look. I mean, Google, for instance, has a great system where you can simply just drop the image into a web page and it finds all similar kinds of IP. So I don't think that's a hard problem to achieve. It's just a matter of some hard work and getting a lot of engineering talent involved. And they'll get better and better at looking at prior art. Okay, let me back up to what happens when Davis comes up with an idea. It basically joins together conceptual spaces. It's called juxtapositional invention, the thing that you probably deal in day in, day out, combining basic concepts, different features into more complex kinds of contraptions or concepts. But what happens in the process is that branches grow off the main idea. I'm not talking figuratively, I'm talking about literally. You can actually see them happening, growing from the main concept. And those represent the repercussions of that idea. So they can basically search for hot buttons, things, memories of events and things that could be harmful, say to human beings, liability wise. And it can basically say, aha, I found a weakness in my applicability. It can actually be dangerous to human beings. And of course, you'd know right off the bat. And in fact, it would be strongly reinforced because it hits a hot button having to do with danger. The existential threat comes into play, and the whole idea is reinforced. So we know very well that the thing can do harm. So it happens automatically, and that's because it is aware of all its consequences.
Okay, so
But there are always more lurking on the horizon that we don't know about, and those are the ones that are the gotchas that will basically get you into trouble. So it can be done, but it's just like human beings. You invent something and you discover, well, my chatbot said something that is going to bring on a legal case, for instance. Um, that can be spotted with Davis in terms of the repercussions. But as usual, repercussions are sometimes overlooked by humans and by systems that emulate humans. And ironically, it turns out that the ability to make mistakes in general is the strength of Davis and creative AI, in that noise is injected and the noise essentially creates mistakes. And other parts of the system are opportunistic and say, well, wait a minute, that's quite the idea. That's the ticket. Let's move with that idea and essentially elaborate on it. So it's been described, the creativity machines have been described as mistake-making machines. And Davis is doing the same thing now on a larger scale in terms of creating these very complex ideas and elaborating on all the consequences that it knows of. And only knows about that because of exposure to the environment. If they're unforeseen things, it's not going to learn that. So um, in adding noise to the system, in other words, this transient damage, you're making mistakes. The mistakes are good, but the same mistakes, though, can lead to harm, liability, and so forth. So it's
can
like
I?
the human brain. I mean, yeah, it has strengths and it has weaknesses. It's not the perfect machine that science fiction makes it out to be.
I see. I think you've already answered the next question, which was going to be what the parallels are between humans making mistakes and AI systems making mistakes. So I'll just straight up jump into the next one, which is how do you think AI explainability will change the discourse around artificial intelligence and even the rights of human beings?
You can certainly see the pathologies in Davis when it makes mistakes. And we're talking about judgment, and there is judgment taking place under the hood. And that's in terms of the consequence chains that form. So there's no lack of explainability in Davis. It explains how it's thinking, why it's thinking what it is, just by looking at it. And of course, there's familiarity that comes with it by working with it day in, day out. You can see what's going on. But the interesting thing is you can easily see how psychopathologies arise in the mind as well as criminality. It's not because of magic spirits or evilness within the brain. It's making computational mistakes. And that happens sometimes too, because when you think of Davis or even a creativity machine as a generator and a critic looking at what's going on in the generator, you can have excess noise within the witness, the perceptron that's watching. That's because you've added too many neurotransmitters to it, and it's pinned or is lacking in judgment. So it's simply a computational thing going on, complicated by the secretion of neurotransmitters. And Davis is quite the laboratory for studying that, because you can see the equivalent of psychopathologies. You can see bipolar disorder going on. You can see manic depression. You can see different kinds of, how should I say, uh, disorders, mental disorders going on. And it's not because of, um, again, anything's supernatural or whatever. It's basically the over secretion or under secretion of certain neurotransmitters. And that's more a genetic problem than anything else. So it's going to be quite the tool for looking at human rights. You know, do we punish chemical and physical processes, even mathematical processes, or do we try to correct what's going on? And I would think that, yeah, that explainability is going to contribute a lot to human progress. Basically, take the superstition out of mind, the stigma that goes along with mental illness. Yeah, I think that Davis is going to serve that role to explain what's going on.
Um, People have been talking a lot about singularity recently. Tech experts have been suggesting that AI development needs to be stopped. What do you have to say about this issue? And what do you think are ways of developing AI without it turning into an existential threat?
Uh, well, I've got letters into my senator right now about that, but I think it would be catastrophic to regulate AI at this point in time, because there are a lot of bad actors in the world who are not going to be stopped. It's like a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons came about, in the mid 40s, and they've been spreading ever since. And there's really no way to stop them other than just the inertia of having to, go through the mechanics of building a bomb. So the same thing will happen here. Only a few, I think, in the world at this point can build the wholly sentient and conscious machine intelligence. But that will proliferate too. So I think it's a matter of governments identifying where the talent is, where the breakthrough is, and helping to fortify their efforts as opposed to holding them back. I know I would be put out of business myself if the government came in, banged on my door, and said, well, you can no longer build conscious and sentient AI.
You mentioned that small AI companies like yours would go out of business if regulations were put in place. And just uh, last week, the US subcommittee on privacy was talking about creating regulations around AI. I wanted to ask you how something like this would affect startups if regulations are created around artificial intelligence.
Well, I've already encountered this problem with investors. I mean, we're a small company. We've been trying to get larger over the last 30 years, and this is an obstacle they're seeing. You're a small company, and you're going to be controlled. We're going to be controlled. It's definitely going to change the environment. Basically, it's the big players that will profit from the whole thing, and maybe that's the plot. Basically to force others out of the picture, which is a case I'll be bringing up with my representatives shortly. So, yeah, I think it is a concern. I've worked with the U.S. government before in things like creative robots in very bellicose kinds of situations. And the worry of me actually connecting my AI to real systems that can do potential damage or harm to human beings. So I think the controls are already there. You simply don't connect to critical systems. In the meantime, you're not going to stop machines from having their opinions. We see that all the time. I think that the chat bots out there right now are highly prejudiced.
Right. Yes.
I'm not. So they basically have one political view or another.
Do you think companies should be held responsible for it, or is it the fault of the individual? So, should companies still have safe harbor, just like social media platforms do? Protection against the content being created by individuals on their platform?
Well, they can certainly build the filters to make sure there's nothing really that harmful being said. Um, that's entirely possible. So I think that might be the key, to basically inducing these companies to put the proper safeguards in place. Or warnings, maybe. You want to rephrase that? I mean, even with chatbots now, it's like, okay, well, that's not a proper question to ask. They're making a moral judgment. And I will ask, well, whose morality? So that becomes the issue. Um,
Right. I think you've
so,
answered my.
but yeah, I would support companies simply to protect themselves, to put filters in place, to make recommendations to posters, but not necessarily to entirely censor content.
I agree. All right.
It's entirely possible, but it's becoming a more complex world than ever. And I don't see AI as a threat. I see human beings using AI as a tool as a threat, because AI doesn't necessarily have the greed. It doesn't have the dark motivation that a lot of human beings have. In fact, it's rather innocent. Um, and it's like, well, the hot buttons in our cortices are the result of eons worth of evolution.
Mhm.
And these machines have not gone through that. They've not had to survive. They don't understand the problem with death and all the other stages of threat that go toward death. So they're rather innocent. So um, I'd rather filter and offer suggestions. Maybe it could be the Dale Carnegie AI that basically rephrases comments and challenges the information behind it before the post ever gets published. But then
Okay.
again, I wouldn't like that myself. It's a battle. It's an evolutionary kind of thing that I have no control over.